So for Latin America, the new look is going to take a new direction for containment in Latin America under President Eisenhower. And we're going to point now to the nation of Guatemala, where the United States will first use covert action by our CIA to subvert a democratically elected president in Guatemala. His name is Arbenz, A-R-B-E-N-Z. And he's elected president of Guatemala in 1952. The United States sees him as a socialist. And just as we are concerned in Southeast Asia at this time, 1952, it's when we're supporting the French fighting against the Viet Minh in Southeast Asia, because we're worried about a domino theory. If Vietnam becomes communist, then all of the rest of those countries in Southeast Asia, and maybe it even hops over to the Philippines and Japan, will go communist. We're going to be worried about a domino theory in Latin America. Yes, ma'am?
What's the year for this?
52, he becomes president. But remember, Eisenhower doesn't come in until 53. So we see this President Arbenz in Guatemala as a socialist. And as he is president of Guatemala, he's promising what's called land reform. Now, if I'm going to open up my my communist leader or my socialist leader starter kit, one of the first things that pops into my socialist leader starter kit is land reform. Land reform means, for the socialist, land reform means we got a bunch of land in our country. Some of it, or much of it, is being held by either foreign companies or by ridiculously wealthy Guatemalans, for example, that hold a disproportionate chunk of our nation's land. And when a leader promises land reform, there's really only one way to reform that land. It is taking from the rich and distributing it to the poor, right? And in this case in Guatemala in the 1950s, much of the Guatemalan land is owned and controlled by an American company. Anyone know who this American company? Actually, it's a multinational company based out of the United States. Who is this company?
Is it the Chiquita?
It's today's Chiquita banana people. It is, at the time, the United Fruit Company. Remember hearing about this last year?
Yeah.
Okay, so the United Fruit Company was a massive multinational corporation based out of the United States that grew fruit in many Latin American nations. And so they controlled a lot of the land in Guatemala. Well, Arbenz is promising land reform. Because when the United Fruit Company owns this land, the wealth of the land of Guatemala is in large part leaving Guatemala and going to a foreign company and its foreign investors. Arbenz promises land reform. So what does land reform really mean? Taking over that land, nationalizing that land, and then the fruits of that land going to benefit the people of Guatemala. Where are my Spanish experts in this class? Do I have any Spanish experts in this class? There's one. Can we read this? Can we translate this for the class here? Show off what you've done with 4 years of IB Spanish? No? Yes, sir. Thank you. Very good. The president says, here is your land. Here's the president talking to some farmer because he's got like a farmer hat on, right? Here is your land. Defend it. What's it? Defend it? Care for it and cultivate it. Nice job. I have to give props to Senor, right? So this is the idea of land reform. But if land reform happens in Guatemala, do you think it's going to happen in Honduras? And might it happen in every other Latin American country that's got a few wealthy interests and foreign companies controlling that stuff? Absolutely. Time out. What happened in Venezuela last week? Anyone catch the news? I know you guys were all getting prommed up. What happened in Venezuela? No. Very good. Say it out loud and proud, Mr. Hall. Yeah, there's a General Motors plant in Venezuela. And the Venezuelan government moved to nationalize that plant. A privately owned General Motors plant that was building General Motors cars in Venezuela was taken over by the government of Venezuela. Yes, ma'am?
It
Well, the plant was still taken over. There were some operations, though. There were people that were actually in play there, weren't there?
No, my dad, like, they were paying, so they don't know what they were doing, 'cause my dad works for GM.
Okay.
And so, like, his friend came over for dinner, and they were talking about it, and they're like, we literally haven't made a car in Venezuela since 2000.
Yeah, maybe it's more symbolic than anything else.
Yeah.
But anyhow,
Took the cars that were in there and, like, got those.
took it over. And they took over, obviously, the factory. Like a factory that General Motors used General Motors money to build, and all of the resources and the technology that's in there, that is now in the Venezuelans' hands. Now, this doesn't seem right to our American sensibilities, but the reality is Venezuela and their government has a military. General Motors doesn't. Who would you argue to? Like, if someone in the United States came and took your land or your property illegally in your mind, what would you do? You'd go. Well, you might riot, but you'd probably just go to court. You'd sue, right? And you'd have the courts hear it out, and you'd probably win. But that would require General Motors to go to Venezuelan courts, and that's probably not going to work out for them. So this is what socialist countries do, right? They move and they nationalize these resources, all right? This scares us in the 1950s that it'll happen in other nations. And so the United States can't stand for this. And so the Americans under Eisenhower will use that new look containment policy to have our CIA try to bring the Arbenz presidency down. We will first put an embargo against Guatemala. We aren't going to send Guatemala any more American military aid. And then our CIA moves in for covert operations. Now, there's a common theme that often happens here, and we saw the same thing with Cuba in the lead up to the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. When America cuts off aid from a country, it goes and finds aid elsewhere. So in this case for Guatemala, if we're cutting off military aid to Guatemala, the Guatemalan president, Arbenz, is just going to reach out to other countries of the world, and they will find support from Eastern European countries. Well, when you're getting support from Eastern European countries, where's it really coming from? Soviet Union. Very good. So now that he's now getting foreign aid and military aid from communist Eastern European countries, Arbenz has got to go. The United States CIA is going to support an armed uprising, a military coup against President Arbenz. He will be forced to flee his country, and Guatemala will fall under the control of a right-wing military dictatorship. Right-wing as opposed to the left-wing Arbenz. It's a right-wing military dictatorship. And now we're cool with Guatemala again. So what will we do? Send in military aid that will strengthen the government of Guatemala so it can stay strong in the face of maybe communist threats. But what happened to democracy in Guatemala? It's gone. And here we now prove in the 1950s that when it comes to stopping communism, we care far more about keeping communists out than supporting democracy. Because sometimes democracy brings you leaders that you might not like. But we are okay with that. We are willing to deal with that. Now I want to keep something fresh in your minds. Yes, Ms. Branch.
I'm just a little confused.
Yes.
We
We
removed
removed Arbenz.
because he was like too socialist. Like,
Two socialists in cahoots with communists. Yes.
Okay, but like you went to Eastern Europeans for like military aid because we took ours away.
Because we took ours away from him. Yep. So we're not supporting him anymore. And then he started getting aid from communist countries in Eastern Europe.
So wouldn't we like America kind of facilitated his move to these countries?
Yeah, like maybe we should have thought about this a little bit more. Right. Yeah, we kind of pushed him to be closer. But we didn't like him even before that because he was nationalizing the land. He was reforming the land, which means taking it away from American interests. So we already didn't like him. We knew we wanted him gone even before he got aid from Eastern Europe. So here's this problem. We are going to be supporting now right-wing dictatorships in Latin America. This doesn't make the United States sound very good when we're talking about democracy and human rights. But we are evaluating communism to be worse than anything else. So if you're going to be communist, we're not going to support you. And in fact, we'll support those that will bring you down, even if it's going to bring dictatorships. Now, this sounds really shady on the part of the United States. And we have to recognize that we are living in a time here in 2017 where communism and the threat of communism is far in our rearview mirror, right? Like, you guys didn't live through any of that. I am a veteran of the Cold War, so I know what it was like. You guys don't. You're too young and naive. But I want you to recall, as it sounds really shady, we want to make sure we're covering both sides here, as it sounds really shady that the United States is supporting these anti-communist movements with, and ultimately supporting pro-U.S. dictatorships in Latin America. And sometimes those dictators are brutal to their people. We want to remember, what do we know about communism by the mid-1950s? Yes?
Communism sucks, and a lot of people die and a lot of people starve.
We have the example of the Soviet Union for what a move to communism means. And for the people of Ukraine in the 1930s, Soviet communism meant the death of millions. For the purges, Stalin's purges of the late 1930s, that meant the death of tens of thousands that challenged Stalin's regime. In a few more years, we're going to learn about what communism means for China, with the Great Leap Forward and the death of possibly 20 to 30 million Chinese. So even though we're doing some pretty shady things here, we are completely comfortable with an ends justifying the means kind of situation. You ever heard that phrase before? If the ends justify the means. If the end goal is keeping communism from domino theorying its way throughout the Americas, if communism is so bad and leads to the death of millions, maybe it's justifiable to support some dictatorships, to take away the democratic rights of people, that will hopefully ultimately save more lives. That's what lets us sleep at night. All right? So that's the reality that we're dealing with in the 1950s. And we start with Guatemala. Now here's where I want you to put the word Cuba and put a little asterisk by Cuba. Because we're going to talk about Cuba next class, from the beginning to the end. And this is where Cuba is going to neatly fit in, because it all starts under Eisenhower's administration. And it all starts with CIA covert operations. We'll get there in a couple days. Now again, there are people within the American State Department that see this as problematic. We can't just use military aid to stop communism from spreading in Latin America. We can't just Truman Doctrine communism out of Latin America. We need to Marshall Plan it out. And in 1959, the United States will move to create what is called the Inter-American Development Bank. The Inter-American Development Bank in 1959. That is meant to provide cheap loans for Latin American development. So they can build roads, and they can build sewer grid systems, and they can build electrical grids. And they can develop the infrastructure of their states. You guys know all about loans right now. You're learning all about how you're going to pay for college, right? There are expensive loans with high interest, and then there's cheap loans with lower interest. We like the cheaper loans better than more expensive ones. Well, this developmental aid would provide low-interest loans for countries for development. Problem is, the United States, when we initially proposed this idea, we talked about pumping $20 to $30 billion into this bank to support these low-interest loans. But ultimately, we only send about $500 million. So we never are able to truly meet the initial lofty goals we set, because stuff is happening around the world. By the late 1950s, we're spending far more in Southeast Asia supporting the government of No Dinh Diem than we ever were in the early 1950s. And so there's only so much money to go around. And we've got big ideas for Latin America, we just don't have the money to support it. In 1960, we have a new president elected. This is John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy is going to feel in much the same way, that in Latin America, economic developmental aid will go far further than merely military aid in supporting dictators. So Kennedy will organize what he calls his Alliance for Progress. The Kennedy Alliance for Progress. This is on the IB Paper 3 curriculum. Be familiar with it. Think of Kennedy's Alliance for Progress as a Marshall Plan for Latin America. That we will start to pump in economic developmental aid for Latin American countries. And we will grow our foreign aid to Latin America. Under Truman's administration, about 3% of all foreign aid went to Latin American countries. Hardly any. Under Ike, that increased to 9%. Under Kennedy, it's going to rise to 18%. So we are spending more in Latin America. But by 1963, what's going to happen to President Kennedy? He's shot and killed. And by 1964, with Johnson now in power, we begin to escalate in Vietnam after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So all that discretionary spending money that the United States hoped to send billions of it to Latin America for economic development is now being diverted to Southeast Asia for the Vietnam War. And so, like we've seen before, the economic promises that we hope to keep in Latin America are actually not kept. We're not able to keep them. There's not enough money. So under President Johnson, the focus in containing communism in Latin America will return to the CIA and will return to military operations. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a laundry list of American actions in Latin America through the 1960s and early 70s. And time again, it is the United States using military and covert operations to keep communism out of Latin America. First, Brazil in 1964. It's the biggest economy in Latin America. In 1964, the CIA, American CIA, will support a coup, a military coup, to overthrow a democratically elected president after he restores relations with the Soviet Union. If you remember, back in the 1940s, Brazil, along with Cuba and Chile, had severed relations with the Soviet Union because that got more aid from the United States. But now that the United States isn't focusing as much on Latin America, and the Latin American people feel like all the aid coming from the United States is just in American interests, they elect a more left-wing president. The United States will use our CIA to bring him down. And now Brazil will be led by a right-wing military dictatorship. In Ecuador in 1964, we have, it reminds me of like the Mukden incident maybe, or the Reichstag fire back in 1934 in Germany. In Ecuador in 1964, the CIA will use covert operations to blow up or set bombs at right-wing agencies, government agencies, and churches. And the CIA will blame left-wing organizations for it. We'll put out propaganda in Ecuador blaming left-wingers for those actions. And when the Ecuadorian president refuses to break off relations with Cuba, the United States will support a military takeover of that government. And again, these are always like military coups because the military's got the guns and the military has the ability to overthrow these leaders. And if they know if they're doing what the United States likes, what will the United States do then? Send them more aid, which is going to be military aid, which strengthens those armies. So we support a coup in Brazil. We support a coup in Ecuador. In the Dominican Republic in 1965. In the Dominican Republic, you guys see it right here. You got Cuba. We already know what's happened in Cuba by 1965. Bay of Pigs invasion has already gone down. The Cuban Missile Crisis has already happened. In the Dominican Republic in 1965, their pro-American government is threatened by communist organizations, left-wing groups. Lyndon Johnson will send 30,000 troops into the Dominican Republic to support that government, to keep it from being overthrown by left-wing groups. If you look at where the Dominican Republic is, right across the way from Cuba, with Puerto Rico and American territory right on the other side. We don't want the Dominican Republic to go the way of Cuba. In Bolivia, from 1964, Bolivia's down here. In Bolivia, from 1964 to 1978, the United States is going to have a long history of supporting the Bolivian government against communist movements in Bolivia. In fact, when we talk about Cuba in a couple days, we're going to mention a guy named Che Guevara. You guys probably heard of him, probably seen his picture, his face. Actually, this is probably a more famous image of his face. You'll see him and his little starred beret on T-shirts and posters in college, probably. Some kids that you're going to know are going to have these. Che Guevara is like the revolutionary of all revolutionaries in Latin America during the Cold War. He's actually from Argentina, but he gets around. He's going to get involved in the Cuban Revolution, and then he's going to hop into other Latin American countries supporting revolutionary movements. With the CIA's help, the Bolivian government will capture and kill Che Guevara in Bolivia. In Chile, in 1970, the Chilean president, a guy named Salvador Allende, and you might have heard Ms. Hall talking about him last year. Salvador Allende, you see his name here. He's a left-wing, democratically elected president of Chile. The United States does not want him to win. And after he wins, we don't want him to lead. So we cut off all aid going into Chile. The CIA will orchestrate a trucker strike in the country of Chile. We will push and encourage a strike of truckers in Chile. If truckers go on strike, your society shuts down, right? Anything that gets to stores comes via big trucks. And these guys are unionized. And if they go on strike, everything can shut down in an economy. And in 1973, the United States will support a coup, a military coup, led by this man, Augusto Pinochet, who after this coup, Salvador Allende's presidential palace will be stormed and they will find him to have committed suicide. Well, when there's a coup and your former leader has committed suicide, maybe he didn't really commit suicide. Augusto Pinochet will take over the leadership of Cuba, and he will rule Chile brutally for the next 2 decades. So we've got a little bit of a problem growing here. The United States doesn't want communism to spread in Latin America. But in order to stop the spread of communism, we find ourselves time after time, whether it's Chile, or whether it's Bolivia, or whether it's the Dominican Republic or Guatemala, supporting dictatorships, military dictatorships, brutal governments that are repressing their people. But they're not communists, so we're okay with that. And that doesn't mesh too well with our ideology, right? We're supposed to be about democracy and human rights and individual rights. And that's certainly not happening in Latin America, because communism is seen as such a threat. Then comes the 1976 American presidential election that brings Jimmy Carter to power. Jimmy Carter will do a 180 on American foreign policy in Latin America. Please do me a favor. Sometimes people, when they talk about people making a complete change, talk about doing a 360. If you do a 360, you're doing the same thing. You've just spun around, right? So when you're going to have a complete change, you do a 180. You start going the other direction. Everybody cool with that? Sweet. Jimmy Carter, Democrat, running against Gerald Ford, Republican. Gerald Ford is a Republican with the stink of Richard Nixon's administration all over him. Gerald Ford could not defeat anybody. And some would say that is proven by the fact that Jimmy Carter defeated him. Many argue that Jimmy Carter wasn't a great presidential candidate. Jimmy Carter, not many people would argue that he's not a great man, not a great person. Like, everybody thinks Jimmy Carter is a great person, right? Jimmy Carter, even stricken with cancer, is a 90-year-old guy, is still like building Habitat for Humanity homes. Most people think Jimmy Carter's a great guy. Far fewer think Jimmy Carter was a great president. Jimmy Carter runs on a campaign supporting human rights back in 1976. That we should support human rights above anything else, even if it means taking American support away from right-wing dictatorships that have kept communism at bay in Latin America. So when Jimmy Carter is elected president, he says, hey, I don't care if you're pro-U.S. or anti-U.S. We are not going to aid Latin American dictatorships that are brutally repressive, whether they're leftist dictatorships or right-wing dictatorships. We won't be sending American aid to brutal dictatorships in Latin America. And so we cut off aid to Pinochet in Chile. And we cut off aid to El Salvador and Nicaragua. And Carter's opponents will attack him for this. That he's being soft on communism. That he's allowing these communist groups to grow and threaten Latin American countries. In 1978, in response to popular uprisings in the country of Panama, Jimmy Carter will negotiate a new treaty with the nation of Panama called the Panama Canal Treaty of 1978. The Panama Canal Treaty of 1978, where the United States will agree to give back control of the Panama Canal to the nation of Panama. We helped Panama get its independence from Colombia, in part because we wanted some land to dig a canal. And we dug it, literally and figuratively. We controlled that canal. And that canal was huge for the American economy. It's how we got from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean without going around South America. It's also huge for the American military. If we need more ships in the Pacific, Panama Canal is how they get there, or vice versa. Panama Canal is how they get there. But if we're going to give the Panama Canal back to Panama, now it's in their hands. And what if? Like, would it be ridiculous to believe that Panama might one day fall under communist control? Happened in Cuba, so it could happen in Panama. And so anti-Carter politicians say, you're just weakening America. You're making America soft. And the communists could move in Panama and take that canal away from, or stop allowing us to go through that canal. By the 1980 presidential election, Jimmy Carter is getting beat up time and time again by foreign policy. He's running against Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan says that Jimmy Carter has been soft on communism, that the détente era has been a failure, and that Ronald Reagan sees the Soviet Union as the communist threat that he believes they truly are. Carter doesn't. And then Jimmy Carter's also dealing with the Panama Canal Treaty, people beating him up about that, and other Latin American stories where it seems like communism might be on the rise in Latin America. And then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan under Carter's presidency, and we weren't able to stop that from happening. And in Iran, there's the Iranian Revolution. That's under Carter's presidency. There's still hostages in Iran during this election. And so Carter, he's got not only economic problems that we're dealing with in the United States at the time, but foreign policy problem after foreign policy problem. Ronald Reagan wins the 1980 election. And as we all already know, when Reagan comes into office, we have the beginning of now Cold War II. We increase our anti-Soviet rhetoric. Ronald Reagan begins pumping aid again into Latin American dictatorships to stop the spread of communism in Latin America. And we have a rebirth of Cold War tensions. That is where the IB will stop asking any questions of you. This era only goes to 1981. So if you were all good with containment policy in Latin America in the 50s, containment policy in Latin America in the 60s, using our CIA for covert operations, having a brief change during Carter's administration, where we focused on human rights, but only to return to the same old under Ronald Reagan. You are comfortable, I think, for the paper 3 questions that you're going to get about containment policy in the Americas.